If their strategic bombing offensive was to succeed, the British had to penetrate the secrets of German radar and develop effective countermeasures. So, in early 1942, military leaders hatched a daring plan: a nighttime assault to snatch a German radar set and its operators from an isolated clifftop in northern France. It was to be the baptism of fire for a fledgling unit that would soon go on to far greater glory and infamy: the 1st Parachute Regiment, AKA the Paras. This is the story of Operation Biting, the forgotten World War II raid to steal Hitler's radar. Our story begins with a key, yet largely forgotten figure in the history of the Second World War, Dr. Reginald Victor, or R.V. Jones. Born in London on September 29, 1911, to a family of modest means, Jones used his considerable intellect to win a scholarship to Wadham College, Oxford, obtaining his PhD in physics in 1934. While working at Oxford's Clarendon Laboratory in the late 1930s, Jones worked on some of the earliest infrared detection technology and soon became a leading expert in the field. Due to this work and his general gregariousness, by the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, Jones had established a network of contacts throughout the defense establishment, including Professor Frederick Lindemann, aka Lord Cherwell, scientific advisor to Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He thus became a much-consulted expert in military scientific intelligence, using his scientific knowledge and deductive powers to anticipate what advanced technology the Germans would deploy next, work out how it functioned, and develop effective countermeasures. He thus had considerable intelligence resources at his disposal, including aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by RAF pilots, interrogations of German prisoners of war, radio signals received by the WWII service listening stations along the British coast, and secret decrypts of Enigma cipher machine signals, known in intelligence circles as Ultra. As covered in our previous video, The Forgotten Tech War, during the Blitz, the 1940 to 1941 Luftwaffe bombing campaign against London and other British cities, Jones was engaged in a secret battle to defeat radio beam guidance systems like Nickerbeam, X-Gerat, and Y-Gerat, used by German pilots to find and bomb their targets at night. During this operation, RAF Photo Reconnaissance Unit, or PRU pilots, returned images of large bedspring-shaped antenna mounted on the coast near Lannion in Brittany, while radio listening stations at Dover detected strange pulse signals at a frequency of 375 MHz. While these were found to be unrelated to the beam guidance systems, at the time few in the British military establishment believed they had anything to do with radar, and many arrogantly assumed that Britain held a monopoly on the technology. This was despite the fact that a sophisticated naval radar called SeaTac had been discovered aboard the German cruiser Admiral Graf Spee after it was scuttled off Montevideo, Uruguay in December 1939. By late 1941, however, Jones and his colleagues had located 27 such aerials along the coast of northern France, while ultra decrypts had yielded the name of the device, Freya. Since the British military had a strict policy against using code names which in any way revealed the purpose of an operation or piece of equipment, at first few thought anything of the moniker. However, during the Battle of the Beams, Jones had correctly deduced that a German device called Wotan, the German version of Odin, the one-eyed king of the Norse gods, used a single navigation beam. He thus wondered whether the code name Freya might have a similar, not-so-hidden meaning. Brushing up on his Norse mythology, Jones discovered that the goddess Freya was closely associated with a magic necklace called Brisingamen, which was guarded by Heimdall, the servant of the gods, said to be able to see 1,000 miles through any kind of weather. It was a tenuous connection, but as Jones later wrote, it is unwise to lay too much stress on this evidence, but these are the only facts that seem to have any relation to our previous knowledge. Actually, Heimdall himself would have seemed the best choice for a code name for RDF, but perhaps it would have been too obvious. It is difficult to escape the conclusion, therefore, that the Freya Gerat is a form of portable RDF. Freya may possibly be associated with Wotan. She was at one time his mistress, although it would have been expected that the Führer would have in this case chosen Freya, Wotan's lawful wife. End quote. But speculation soon gave way to reality, as RAF bombers began flying ever more night missions over occupied Europe, where they fell prey to surprisingly accurate fire from anti-aircraft guns and night fighters. These were, of course, being directed by radar sets, which, as radio-equipped Ferret aircraft soon confirmed, operated at a frequency of 375 MHz, the same as Freya. Despite this compelling evidence, however, the RAF top brass dismissed German radar technology as inferior, speculating that the Germans had simply copied a British radar set abandoned during the 1940 Battle of France. But while the Germans had indeed captured such a set near Boulogne, they had actually judged it inferior to their own equipment. Indeed, the Germans were in many ways ahead of the British in radar technology, with the Freya and SeaTac sets having first entered service all the way back in 1936, 2 years ahead of the British chain home system, which had helped win the Battle of Britain. However, this technology failed to impress Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, as it was useless to the type of quick offensive land war Germany was planning to wage. It was not until the Allies turned the tables with its strategic bombing offensive that German radar finally came into its own. Yet while most of the RAF establishment continued to ignore the threat of German radar, some, such as Assistant Chief of Air Staff for Intelligence, Air Vice Marshal Charles Medhurst, understood the enormity of R.V. Jones's discoveries. As Jones later recalled, he told me how impressed he had been by my work on the beams and said that he would like me to take over responsibility for analysing how the German night defences worked. Jones was duly assigned a small staff including Derek Garrard and Charles Frank of the telecommunications research establishment in Swanage, Dorset. The team's first order of business was to discover how the German anti-aircraft guns and night fighters were guided to their targets. Freya, with its relatively long wavelength, was too inaccurate for this task and served merely as an early warning radar, alerting German defences of incoming bombers. For said bombers to be accurately targeted, a smaller radar with a shorter wavelength was needed. Ultra decrypts had revealed the existence of a device codenamed Würzburg, while in March 1941, RAF Ferret aircraft detected what appeared to be radar pulses at a frequency of 570 MHz. At the same time, neutral Chinese and American citizens living in Berlin provided British intelligence with pictures of a giant dish-shaped device installed near the Berlin Zoo, which appeared to be connected to the city's anti-aircraft devices. But while this was a good start, it was not enough information to determine how Würzburg worked, or more importantly, how to counter it. It was then that Jones's assistant, Charles Frank, had a brainwave. Recently, RAF PRU aircraft had returned with photographs of a Freya installation on the French coast near Bruneval, a small hamlet just north of Le Havre in Normandy. Examining these photographs, Frank spotted a large farmhouse surrounded by outbuildings near the Freya installation, likely being used as the billets for the radar's crew. Just south of this was a large chateau perched on a clifftop, which likely served as billets for the officers. At the end of a well-worn track leading west from the chateau was a small black dot, too small and grainy in the photograph to be clearly identified. While photo interpreters had dismissed the dot as a latrine or the entrance to an air raid shelter, Frank suspected it might just be the Würzburg radar that they were looking for. To find out, Jones's group contacted the RAF's No. 1 Photo Reconnaissance Unit at Benson Airfield in Oxfordshire. In early November 1941, squadron leader Tony Hill took off from Benson in his sky blue PRU Spitfire and dashed across the channel toward Bruneval. These kinds of missions, known as dicing, were extremely hazardous. Armed with nothing but cameras, pilots flew at treetop level over enemy territory, braving flak and collisions with buildings, telephone poles, and other obstacles in order to capture the closest, clearest photographs of their targets. Unfortunately, on this particular mission, Hill was a bit too slow on the shutter and failed to capture any clear images of the Bruneval site. However, on returning to RAF Benson, he confirmed the existence of a radar dish and promised to try again the following day. This was exceptionally foolhardy. Among PRU pilots, there was an unspoken rule that one never photographed the same area twice. Yet up Hill went, and when his photographs were developed, they revealed exactly what Charles Frank had suspected. At the end of the path, leading away from the chateau, stood a small circular radar dish, perhaps 3 meters across. The team had found their Würzburg. This discovery immediately suggested a tantalizing possibility. Bruneval lay only 150 kilometers across the English Channel, a mere puddle jump. What was more, Tony Hill's aerial photographs revealed a path leading from the radar site down and narrowed afar in the cliffs to a small secluded beach. Shown on maps as La Descente Anglaise, this path had been used for centuries by English and French smugglers, sailors, and tourists to enter and exit the country. Might it not be possible, Jones's team wondered, to land a small raiding party and capture components of the Würzburg and even some of the radar's operators? Jones mentioned the idea to Lord Sherwell, who then passed it along to Prime Minister Churchill. This was exactly the type of operation that appealed to Churchill, who in June 1940 had ordered the establishment of an elite force known as the Commandos to carry out small butcher-and-bolt raids against targets in occupied Europe. Via the air staff, the proposal was passed up to the Chief of Combined Operations, Lord Lewis Mountbatten. As the name suggests, Combined Operations was an inter-service department of the War Office which coordinated elements of the Army, Navy, and Air Force in order to carry out commando raids. Mountbatten liked the idea of raiding Bruneval, and on January the 21st, the plan was approved by the Chiefs of Staff under the codename Operation Biting. While Charles Frank's official proposal called for the landing force to approach Bruneval by sea, this plan was immediately rejected. The coast was too heavily defended, meaning the raiders would be cut to pieces before they ever reached the radar site. Instead, it was decided to use one of the newest and most experimental units in the British Armed Forces, the paratroopers. In the late 1930s, the British learned that both the German and Soviet armies were assembling large units of airborne troops designed to parachute into combat and seize key objectives like bridges and crossroads ahead of an advancing army. However, they paid little attention to these developments and made no attempt to create airborne forces of their own. But then, in the spring and summer of 1940, German paratroopers, known as Fallschirmjäger, carried out a series of spectacular operations during the invasions of Denmark, France, and the Low Countries, including the capture of the seemingly impenetrable Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael. Impressed by these feats, Prime Minister Churchill decided that Britain must have paratroopers of its own, and on June 22, 1940, issued a memorandum to the War Office calling for the formation of a corps of at least 5,000 parachute troops. At the time, however, such a demand was overly ambitious. The British Expeditionary Force had just been evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, leaving Britain chronically short of men, equipment, and other resources. Nonetheless, a parachuting school was established at RAF Ringway near Manchester, under the command of Air Commodore Sir Nigel Norman. Initially known as the Central Landing Establishment, it was later renamed No. 1 Parachute Training School. Due to the lack of resources, the only aircraft that could be spared to drop the parachutists was the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, a 1930s twin-engined medium bomber, which had by this time become obsolete in its original role. It was far from an ideal choice. To avoid striking the Whitley's wide twin tail, parachutists had to exit through a hole cut in the floor of the rear fuselage. This was a fraught process even under ideal conditions, and many a trainee suffered the so-called Whitley kiss, striking their heads and even breaking their teeth on the lip of the hole on the way out. Even worse, if the jumpers' canopies became fouled or otherwise failed to deploy, they were doomed, for unlike their American counterparts, British paras carried no reserve parachutes. And even a minor mistiming of the jump could prove deadly, as was the case during one exercise when a stick of trainee parachutists was accidentally dropped into the River Clyde in Scotland, never to be seen again. Weapons and equipment were also in short supply, and airborne troops being a brand new concept in the British military, the unit was forced to improvise and learn as they went along. For instance, early British paras wore brown gabardine jump smocks and cut-down domed helmets directly modelled after those used by the German Fallschirmjäger. There was also considerable confusion over how the paras should be organised and whether they should be placed under the command of the Army or the Air Force. While today airborne troops are nearly always associated with the army, this was not always the case. Indeed, the German Fallschirmjäger, the first airborne force to see combat, were actually a branch of the Luftwaffe. Yet, despite these difficulties, by early 1941, a highly trained and motivated corps of around 500 paras had been formed. Initially simply known as No. 2 Commando or the 11th Special Air Service Battalion, not to be confused with the modern SAS, formed later that year by the way, in September 1941, the unit was renamed the 1st Parachute Battalion. It would eventually grow to become the 1st Parachute Brigade and then the 1st Parachute Division. On November 3, 1941, the division was placed under the command of Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning, who would come to be known as the father of the British Airborne Forces and the architect of Operation Market Garden, the disastrous airborne assault on Nazi-occupied Holland in September 1944. He was also, incidentally, the husband of best-selling author Daphne du Maurier, his estate in Menabilly in Cornwall serving as inspiration for the fictional Manderley in his wife's classic 1938 novel Rebecca. While the Operation Biting raid on Bruneval is today recognised as the British Paras' first battle honour, it was not, in fact, their first combat mission. That dubious honour belongs to Operation Colossus, launched on February 10, 1941. This mission called for 38 paras under the command of Major Trevor Pritchard to jump near Caltrini in southern Italy and destroy the Trigino aqueduct, which supplied fresh water to a large region, including the naval base and Taranto. After completing their objective, the paras would then withdraw to the coast, where they would be exfiltrated by the Royal Navy submarine HMS Triumph. But right from the start, everything went wrong. Due to navigational errors and icing of the aircraft's drop mechanisms, a large number of paras, including the 6 Royal Engineers tasked with blowing up the aqueduct, were dropped 3 kilometers from the target, while the parachute containers holding most of the team's explosives never arrived. Nonetheless, the remaining paras made their way to the target and succeeded in destroying one of the aqueduct's piers. However, in their attempt to reach the exfiltration point, all 38 were captured by the Italian army and spent the rest of the war as POWs. Still, this was a far better fate than that suffered by their civilian interpreter, Fortunato Picci, who was tortured and executed as a traitor to Italy. Worse still, the damage to the aqueduct was repaired before Taranto and the surrounding area experienced any serious water shortages, rendering the mission a complete failure. Nonetheless, Operation Colossus was a propaganda and morale victory for the British, proving that their armed forces could still take the fight to the enemy and demonstrating in theory, if not in practice, the potential of airborne forces. Operation Biting would give the Paras a second chance to prove their mettle. To carry out the assault, Brigade Commander Lieutenant Colonel Richard Gale chose C Company of 2 Para, commanded by Company Sergeant Major Gerald Strachan, who he judged to be furthest along in their training. Of the 180 men in C Company, 111 would ultimately take part in the raid, along with 1 officer and 8 sappers from the Royal Engineers Parachute Squadron. 40 men from B Company were also attached to the operation to serve as reserves and replacements if needed. In a bid for efficiency, no medics would be taken along. Every officer was instead given 6 morphine syrettes and field dressings to deal with any wounded. Dropped in sticks of 10 from 12 Whitley aircraft, the raiders were divided into 5 sections based on their respective tasks during the raid, each section being named after a British naval hero. Nelson, commanded by Lieutenant Ewan Chasteris, and Captain John Ross, who also served as mission second in command. Drake, commanded by Lieutenant Peter Narmoth. Jellicoe, commanded by Lieutenant Peter Young. Rodney, commanded by Lieutenant John Timothy, and Hardy, led by the overall commander of the raid, Major John Frost. Though he would later attain legendary status for his service in North Africa, Sicily, and especially at Arnhem during the doomed Operation Market Garden, at this point in the war, John Frost had yet to see real combat. Born in Pune, India, on December 31st, 1912, Frost graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1932 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Cameronians. He served in Palestine during the 1939 Arab Revolt and then Iraq before returning to the UK, where he was among the first officers to volunteer for the fledgling Airborne Brigade. The Biting plan called for the 120 Paras to be dropped onto a small 600-meter-long landing zone around 1 kilometer east of the radar site. Due to the risk of injury on landing, Sten submachine guns, pistols, and grenades could be tucked into the Paras' jump smocks, while heavier weapons and equipment like Lee Enfield rifles, Bren light machine guns, Hawkins anti-tank mines, and radios had to be dropped separately in containers. This was perhaps the riskiest aspect of the operation. Not only did the raiders risk being dispersed over a wide area, but the time needed for them to regroup and recover their weapons was time the enemy could use to mobilize and mount an effective defense. Indeed, the vulnerability of lightly armed airborne troops against well-entrenched defenders had been dramatically revealed the year before, when in May 1941, some 22,000 German Fallschirmjäger landed on the Greek island of Crete. The largest airborne landing in history up to that point, and the first attempt to capture a target entirely from the air, the operation, codenamed Operation Mercury, proved a Pyrrhic victory, with the Germans losing nearly 6,000 men and 3,000 aircraft. In the wake of this near disaster, Adolf Hitler forbade any further large-scale airborne operations, and thereafter the Fallschirmjäger served mainly as elite ground troops or carried out smaller-scale raids, such as the daring mountaintop rescue of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini on September 12, 1943, but that is a story for another video. In any event, as the successful assault on Fortress Eben Emmel demonstrated, the most effective way of maintaining the vital element of surprise was to land fully armed paratroopers directly on the target using assault gliders like the German DFS-230. But while the British had developed their own assault gliders, the General Aircraft Hotspur and Hamilcar and the Airspeed Horsa, by the time Operation Biting was being planned, not enough gliders or trained pilots were available. Instead, the Horsa would not be used in combat until November 1942 as part of Operation Freshman, an unsuccessful attempt to destroy the Norse hydro-heavy water plant in Vemork, Norway. The success of Biting thus depended heavily on surprise, the cover of darkness, and the accuracy of the drop. Once the raiders had regrouped and recovered their weapons and equipment, the different sections would set off on their respective missions. Jellicoe, Hardy, and Drake would assault and secure the radar site, while Nelson cleared and secured the German positions defending the beach from which the raiders would evacuate. Meanwhile, Rodney would fan out in a wide arc around the radar site to delay German troops approaching from the surrounding countryside. At first, Derek Garrard of R.V. Jones's scientific intelligence team volunteered to accompany the radars and inspect and disassemble the Würzburg radar. However, he was turned down on grounds that he knew too much about British radar technology to risk being captured. This task thus fell to RAF Flight Sergeant Charlie Cox, a former cinema projectionist and talented radar mechanic who, on January 30th, 1942, was, in the military parlance, voluntold into operation. Despite having never been aboard an aircraft or even a ship before, Cox was immediately run through an abbreviated jump course at RAF Ringway. He would be assisted in his task by Major Dennis Vernon of the Royal Engineers, who, with the help of a similarly looking British gun-laying radar set, was given a crash course in photographing the German radar set using a Leica flashlight camera. Once the work at the radar site was complete, all sections would make a coordinated retreat down the cliffs to the beach, the engineers clearing any mines using portable metal detectors. The raiders would then be evacuated by a small Royal Navy flotilla waiting just offshore. Commanded by Lieutenant Commander Frederick Cook of HMS Tormentor, the flotilla comprised 6 landing craft assault or LCAs and 2 landing craft support or LCSs, which would be ferried to the rendezvous point by the former Belgian cross-channel ferry HMS Prince Albert. To provide fire support during the evacuation, each LCA would also be manned by 4 soldiers armed with either Bren light machine guns or 55 caliber Boys anti-tank rifles. The LSCs were also equipped with 20mm Oerlikon automatic cannons. During the early planning stages, the Army requested that the evacuation craft be manned by regular line troops to prove they could be used in raiding operations. General Browning resisted, insisting that biting be a purely airborne operation, but in the end the Army won out and 40 men from the Royal Fusiliers and the Monmouth Regiment were provided for the task. The very last component of the raid was Noah, a landing party consisting of 1 man, civilian radar specialist Donald Priest. If required, he was to come ashore to help the paras identify and secure the radar components and documents. But before the raid could take place, the planners at Combined Operations Headquarters needed more information about the Brunavall site. Aerial photographs and signals intelligence could only reveal so much. Gleaning finer details like enemy troop dispositions, minefields, and other defenses required good old-fashioned human intelligence, i.e., eyes on the ground. The British turned to the French resistance, specifically Agent Gilbert Renault, better known by his codename Colonel Remy. Remy assigned 2 fellow agents to reconnoiter the Brunavall area, Charles Chauveau, codenamed Charmaine, and Roger Dumont, codenamed Paul. Chauveau, a former navigation instructor in the French Air Force, owned a successful auto garage in Paris and consequently had been issued a coveted Ausweis or travel permit by the German authorities. This would allow him to travel freely through the zone into Interdit or Freedom Zone along the French Atlantic coast. In early 1942, Chauveau and Dumont left Paris and drove towards the coast, staying in seedy hotels where their identities wouldn't be questioned. On arriving in Brunavall, they checked in at the local hotel restaurant, whose owners, the Vernier family, were friends of Chauveau and sympathetic to the resistance. Their hospitality and assistance was particularly remarkable, given that at the time an entire platoon of German infantry was billeted at the hotel. The following morning, the pair set off across the snow-covered fields towards the coast, where they met a German sentry guarding the defile down to the beach. Speaking perfect German, Chauveau explained that Dumont had come all the way from Paris and very much wanted to see the ocean before he returned home. By an absurd stroke of luck, the apparently very bored sentry enthusiastically nodded and offered to escort the men down to the beach. There, he offhandedly mentioned that the beach was not, in fact, mined, a piece of information that would prove vital to the coming operation. As Chauveau continued to chat up the sentry, even offering him cigarettes, Dumont attempted to memorize every detail of the future battlegrounds. The men then bid the friendly German a farewell and set off for Paris. So remember, if you think you're bad at your job, it could always be oh so much worse. The intelligence gathered by Chauveau and Dumont was duly radioed to British intelligence, who, based on this and other sources, began piecing together a comprehensive picture of the Brunavall site. On the British battle map, the chateau perched atop the cliff, originally belonging to the Gossip family, was designated Lone House, while the Würzburg radar out front was dubbed Henry. Northeast of the radar site, the Gossip farmhouse and outbuildings were named Rectangle. South of these, the defile leading down to the beach was defended from the south by a series of trenches and barbed wire entanglements fronting a villa named Stella Maris, which the British dubbed Beach Fort, and from the north by a set of concrete pillboxes dubbed Redoubt. The 1 Freya and 2 Würzburg radars at the site were manned by 100 Luftwaffe personnel of the 23rd Flugmelder Signals Company, commanded by Captain Prince Alexander Ferdinand von Prusen, coincidentally a blood relative of Combined Operations Chief Lord Louis Mountbatten. These men were billeted in the Gossip farmhouse and outbuildings, which also housed a communication center and a garage. In addition, the area was garrisoned by elements of the 685th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Ernst George von Eisenhardt-Rother, whose headquarters were located in the nearby town of Etretat. These soldiers were billeted in various places, including the Stella Maris Villa and the nearby town of La Poterie. But while these defences looked formidable on paper, several factors played into the attackers' hands. First, all the trenches, pillboxes, and other defensive structures had been built in anticipation of a seaborne assault, meaning an airborne landing had a good chance of achieving surprise. Second, the 23rd Flugmelder had only just arrived in the area, and communications with nearby infantry headquarters were still unreliable. Third, the local anti-aircraft guns were still linked to old-fashioned sound detectors rather than radar, and were thus relatively inaccurate. And fourth, none of the infantry units in the area had their own motorized transport, meaning that if and when the alarm was sounded, they would have to reach their battle stations on foot. While Combined Operations was putting the finishing touches on the battle plan, Major Frost and his men were training hard for their daring mission. In the lead-up to the raid, C Company was headquartered at Tilshead in Wiltshire, carrying out most of their training exercises in nearby Alton Priors. In addition to jump training, the Paras practiced their battle plan on terrain re-landscaped by the Royal Engineers to resemble the drop zone in France. However, for security reasons, no one but Frost was told exactly where they would be landing or what their objective would be. As a cover story, the Paras were told that they were preparing for a large-scale demonstration for the military brass in which they would drop onto the Isle of Wight, carry out a simulated raid, and be extracted by sea. While the training largely went smoothly, tension soon arrived in the form of the radar's designated interpreter, Private Peter Walker. Born Peter Nagel in Berlin in 1916, Walker and his family left Germany in 1936 due to anti-Semitism, moving first to France and then to Britain, where his father established the successful textile firm Moran Fabrics. While Walker certainly had no love for the Nazis, the presence of a German in the Tilshead camp made the Paras uneasy. As Major Frost later wrote, "So many things could go wrong with our little party, and we had been taught to fear the enemy's intelligence. With all the talk in England, and previously about the Fifth Column, I would not help thinking that the enemy probably knew all about us and what we were training for. There was a distinctly eerie feeling to having a Hun on strength." Meanwhile, at HMS Tormentor in Hampshire, Lieutenant Commander Cook was supervising the hoisting of the landing craft aboard HMS Prince Albert. On February the 9th, he sailed north to Gorlock in Scotland for a joint exfiltration exercise with Frost's Paras. The operation was a disaster, with navigational errors causing the rescue flotilla to land several kilometers away. As he and his men waited in vain on the beach, Frost grimly pondered their situation. The possibility of being left stranded on the coast of France after we had done our job was unpleasant. And there was more bad news. On February the 12th, the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, long bottled up in Brest Harbour in France, launched Operation Cerberus, dashing north up the English Channel and escaping safely into German waters. 4 days later, some 80,000 troops were captured when Singapore fell to the Japanese, the single largest colonial defeat in the history of the British Empire. Britain was in desperate need of a win. And so training for biting continued. More joint Army-Navy exercises were carried out on the beaches at Weymouth and Swanage with similarly dismal results, while on February 15th, the Paras performed a live rehearsal jump near General Browning's headquarters at Sirencott House. While thankfully nobody suffered any serious injuries, mistimed drops caused the Paras to be scattered widely across the countryside. As Frost later recalled, "It was a shambles, disorder and confusion, and a mighty waste of time. The general said he was satisfied, more than I was." Another practice jump was planned for the 17th, but freezing weather made the ground too hard for safe landings. Frost and his Paras thus spent their time practicing ground maneuvers. That night, the NCOs were given the outline of their operational tasks, while the following day, the Paras were assigned to their respective dropsticks. Finally, on the 19th, the raiders finally learned the purpose of their mission and were shown a detailed plaster model of the target area, though its exact location remained secret until the night of the jump itself. By this time, only a week remained until the moon and tide conditions would be ideal for the operation. If the raiders missed the window, they would have to wait a whole other lunar cycle to try again. With D-Day fast approaching, Frost stepped up the intensity of the training. On February the 20th, the Paras were dropped off at their simulated target area by truck, while the Whitley bombers dropped their equipment containers. However, the containers landed wide, and while the Paras finally managed to gather their equipment and make their way to the beach, once again, the Navy failed to find them and instead landed 16 kilometers away. On the 23rd, the two teams tried again, but this time the Navy miscalculated the tides and the LCAs became helplessly stranded on the tidal flats. None of this boded well for the mission's chances, but there was nothing to be done. The raiders had run out of time. On February 24th, final preparations for Operation Biting began. While the Paras cleaned their weapons and checked their equipment, 16 newly modified Whitley aircraft of 51 Squadron 4 Group RAF flew from Yorkshire to RAF Thruxton, Hampshire. The squadron was commanded by Group Captain Percy Pickard, a highly decorated bomber pilot well known to the British people for his appearance in the Academy Award-winning 1941 propaganda film Target for Tonight. Pickard would later be killed on February the 18th, 1944, while leading Operation Jericho, a daring and highly controversial attack on Amiens prison in northern France. Later that day, the Paras were driven from their home base in Tilshead to Thruxton, but at the last minute the jump was scrubbed due to poor weather. The following day brought the same news. As one para later recalled, "We are all thoroughly miserable. Each morning we brace ourselves for the venture, and each night, after a further postponement, we have time to think of all the things that can go wrong and to reflect that if we don't go on Thursday, we shall have to wait for a whole month to pass before the conditions may be suitable. After all, the weather in the English Channel in February and March is not inclined to be suitable." Then, at 15:07 on February the 27th, 1942, Admiral Sir William James, Commander-in-Chief of Portsmouth Naval Base, sent out a signal: "Carry out Operation Biting tonight." Shortly thereafter, Lord Mountbatten sent a message of his own: "To all hands, good luck. Bite 'em hard." The party, as British fighting men call military operations, was on. At 1700 hours, HMS Prince Albert sailed from Portsmouth, escorted by the destroyer HMS Blencarthur and 5 RAF motor gunboats, or MGBs, and set off across the Channel toward France. Meanwhile, at Thruxton, the Paras, accompanied by a pipe band playing various Scottish regimental songs, climbed aboard their aircraft. It was to prove an uncomfortable flight, as one para later recalled, "We put on our silk gloves and crawled into sleeping bags for warmth. The Whitley's ribbed aluminium floor was fiendishly uncomfortable. Ahead we could hear a kite revving prior to takeoff, and then it was away. Others followed until it was our turn. The whole machine throbbed and bumped and dragged itself off the ground as though it had great big heavy sloppy feet. Nobody slept in that dim-lit metal cigar." At the last minute, Major Frost was informed that there was deep snow covering the target. He cursed. White overalls had been procured for better camouflage, but these had been left behind in Tilshead. Frost had reason to be nervous, as he later recalled, "We knew so little. The Germans were to us a terrible people. Their armies knew no halting, and despite reverses in front of Moscow, they seemed formidable in the extreme." But there was no turning back now. Between 22:15 and 22:24, all 12 Whitleys, packed with men and drop containers, roared off the runways at Thruxton. When all were airborne, Group Captain Pickard sent the coded message Walnut 12 and led his squadron out over the English Channel. At the same time, Douglas A-20 Boston light bombers of 23 Squadron RAF were carrying out a series of diversionary raids around the Bruneval area. This, it was hoped, would help disguise 51 Squadron's true mission. Down below, Lieutenant Commander Cook's exfiltration flotilla was moving into position. At 23:06, all aboard HMS Prince Albert cheered as they saw the Cap Antifa lighthouse switch on, exactly where it should be. As Cook later recalled, "We could not believe our good luck, but not for long. The Hun didn't switch on for us, but for 2 German destroyers and 2 E-boats moving slowly towards Le Havre." Thankfully, the flotilla was not spotted, and at 01:30 hours, it reached Point X, 3 kilometers off Bruneval. The LCAs and LSCs were lowered into the water, whereupon the Prince Albert and Blencarthur withdrew. Now all the sailors and soldiers aboard the landing craft could do was wait and hope. The 150-kilometer flight from Thruxton to Bruneval should only have taken a few minutes, but to ensure an accurate drop, the Whitleys of 51 Squadron took a more circuitous route, making landfall at the Fécamp and following the coast southwards before turning 180 degrees around Le Havre and flying north towards the target. To avoid detection by German radar, they flew low and fast, sometimes skimming barely 15 meters above the waves. In the aircraft's cramped fuselages, spirits were high, the Paras loudly singing songs and passing around canteens of strong tea fortified with rum. However, as the flight wore on, a problem soon appeared: the urgent need to urinate, which the Paras' closed-bottom jump smocks rendered impossible. Later, these garments would be redesigned with a snap-opening crotch flap and better camouflage to create the Denison smock, which, along with the maroon beret and Pegasus badge, would become emblematic of British airborne forces during the Second World War. But as the squadron crossed the coast, the mood became deadly serious as German anti-aircraft batteries opened up, filling the sky with glowing strings of tracer rounds. The gunners aboard the Whitleys returned fire, with one actually managing to kill a German soldier on the ground. And while several shells did hit the Whitleys, none were seriously damaged. As the squadron neared the drop zone, the Paras hooked up their parachute static lines and sat down in single file before the open jump well. The pilots dropped the aircraft's landing gear to drop their airspeed to just 144 km per hour, just above stall speed, while the navigators in the bomber's perspex nose domes searched for the drop zone below. On spotting it, they flipped a switch to activate the green jump light in the rear fuselage. Then, one after another, the paras launched themselves through the well and into the abyss. First over the drop zones were two sticks of Nelsons who jumped at around 1400 hours on February the 28th, 1942. Though their dark uniforms and parachute-like canopies stood out like sore thumbs against the fresh snow blanketing the fields, these 20 men safely touched down right on target and swiftly recovered their equipment. Unfortunately, subsequent drops were nowhere near as accurate. Lieutenant Charteris and Sergeant Daniel Grieve of Group Nelson became separated from the rest of their stick, landing 3 kilometers southwest of the drop zone near a town ominously called L'Enfer, French for hell. Then, spotting Charteris and Grieve's parachutes down below and believing they were over the drop zone, the following aircraft dropped another stick of Rodneys on top of them. The aircraft flown by Sergeant Andy Cook ran into further trouble when it strayed too close to the ocean and the 6th man in its stick of Rodneys either failed or refused to jump. Cook turned west and began flying back to Britain with 5 paras still on board, but soon turned back and dropped the remaining men. Unfortunately, the equipment containers had already been released in the first drop, leaving the 5 men separated and without weapons. Over the next 15 minutes, the remaining 7 Whitleys droned overhead, dropping paratroopers all over the target area. The only other stick to land anywhere near the drop zone was that containing Major Frost, CSM Strachan, radar specialist Sergeant Charlie Cox, and German interpreter Peter Walker. By the time the last Whitley disappeared out over the channel, a full 1/3 of the raiding force had been dispersed far from the drop zone. Many of the equipment containers also could not be found, leaving the paras chronically short of weapons and ammunition. As Lieutenant Charteris later recalled, "That was a nasty moment. I don't think there's any feeling quite so unpleasant as suddenly finding yourself in enemy territory and not knowing where you are." Nonetheless, the paras pressed on with their mission as best they could. As Major Frost gathered his forces for the assault on the radar site at Lone House, Lieutenant John Timothy with his Rodneys and Lieutenant Naumoff with his Drakes fanned out into a defensive perimeter around the chateau, ready to face enemy defenders when they arrived. As they moved into position, they remarked how eerily quiet it was. Save for some sporadic anti-aircraft fire in the distance, nobody was shooting at them. Against all odds, the raiders had achieved complete surprise, and the confused German defenders were slow to respond to their presence. The local Luftwaffe commander, Captain von Prussen, was away in Paris that evening, while many men of the 685th Infantry Regiment had just returned from night maneuvers and were sound asleep in their beds. And when the drone of aero engines first approached the coast, most of the Luftwaffe's personnel manning the radar sites had scrambled to their bomb shelters, anticipating an air raid. It was not until observers at the Cap Tifa lighthouse spotted parachute canopies descending from the sky that senior Luftwaffe Sergeant Rudy Lang, stationed at Gossett Farm, aka the Rectangle, sounded the alarm, phoning the local headquarters in Etretat. In response, Luftwaffe Lieutenant Rubin gathered 2 NCOs and a driver and set off in a staff car toward Gossett Farm. They had not driven far when they came under fire by Bren Garner of Lieutenant Timothy's Rodneys, who shot out the Germans' headlights and forced them to retreat and find a safer route. These were the first shots, on the ground at least, of Operation Biting. Over at La Poterie, the alert had reached Army Lieutenant Hoon, who telephoned Sergeant Trains at the Stella Maris Villa and ordered him and his men to take up defensive positions overlooking the beach. Trains duly issued his men with a captured French Châteauroux Model 24 light machine gun, ammunition and flares, and descended into the trenches fronting the villa, the so-called beach fort on British maps. With only 9 men under his command, Trains could not divide his force and occupy the pillboxes to the north of the villa, what the British had dubbed the redoubt. This proved a fateful decision, for while waiting for the missing Lieutenant Charteris and his Nelsons to arrive, Major Frost ordered Sergeant David Tasker to occupy the redoubt and secure the raiders' evacuation route down the beach. Meanwhile, back at La Poterie, Lieutenant Hoon aroused 15 of his exhausted men and began the 2-kilometer march to Gossett Farm. Ironically, the raiders' sloppy drop actually worked in their favor, with paratroopers scattered widely about several square kilometers. The Germans found it difficult to discern the true purpose of the assault. Assuming that the true target was the Freya radar, many soldiers took up defensive positions around that site and did not participate in the actual fighting. Having waited long enough for Charteris and the Rodneys, Frost decided to press on and led his men from the drop zone to the radar site 1 kilometer away. After surrounding Lone House, Frost gave the agreed-upon signal to attack, 3 blasts from his whistle. The paras broke down the front door of the chateau and stormed inside, only to find the building empty and abandoned. 6 months earlier, in August 1941, a British air raid had dropped an incendiary bomb on the building, then being used as a barracks. Realizing the house was too prominent a target, the Germans abandoned it and instead built a large dugout a few hundred meters away. The only occupant of the house that night was a Luftwaffe sentry, Paul Kaferbitz, who opened fire on the paras as they stormed up the stairs. The paras responded with a burst of Sten gunfire, killing Kaferbitz instantly. With the lone house secured, Frost and his assault party moved on to their primary objective, the Würzburg radar, aka Henry. But as they crossed the yard to the radar site, they were suddenly spotted. As Lieutenant Young later recalled, "Then we were seen. Groups of Germans wearing overcoats over pajamas climbed slowly up from the dugouts and stood hand in pockets against the cold night air, just watching us. None carried arms, and we discovered later they thought we were German soldiers on maneuvers." Moments later, Sergeant Gerhard Wenzel recognized the soldiers and British and called to his men to take up arms and open fire. The paras opened fire first, though, mortally wounding Wenzel. They also shot a radar technician, Hans Senge, as he tried to sabotage the Würzburg with an explosive charge. Sergeant Wiley Emonate emptied his MP-40 submachine gun at the paras before fleeing, a dubious act of bravery for which he would be awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. The rest of the Luftwaffe personnel simply scattered, with one radar technician leaping off the cliff and nearly falling to his death before being cajoled up and captured by a para with the impossibly badass nickname of Sergeant Gregory Mac the Knife Mackenzie. As Lieutenant Young later reflected on the darkly comic scene, "I thought I had seen nothing funnier than a German trying to scramble up the lip of a cliff with his hands up." With time of the essence, Sergeant Cox and Major Vernon set to work on Henry. Cox was impressed by the engineering of the Würzburg, whose key components were all housed in removable boxes for easy replacement. However, the demounting party soon realized that they had brought the wrong tools for the job, forcing them to use crowbars and brute force to wrench the modules right off the radar. When the receiver antenna at the center of the dish stubbornly resisted removal, Cox and Vernon simply chopped it off with a hacksaw. They also used chisels to cut off the data plates, which could give R.V. Jones and his boffins back in England a rough idea of overall production numbers. But their work was soon made more difficult as German machine gun fire began descending on the radar site. While the fire was fairly inaccurate, Private Hugh McIntyre was nonetheless shot through the head and killed, while Corporal Geoffrey Haslop was wounded in the thigh. As Frost later recalled with classic British understatement, "It became extremely uncomfortable in our area." As the light attracted gunfire, Frost ordered Cox and Vernon to extinguish their torches and not to use the flashbulbs supplied with their Leica camera. As a result, all the photographs taken by Vernon were later deemed useless. What worried Frost the most was the Germans bringing up heavy weapons, especially mortars. Thus, while the battle plan originally allocated 30 minutes at the radar site, after only 10 minutes, Frost ordered the demounting team to halt and for the paras to evacuate. The radar components were loaded onto a handcart brought specially for this purpose, and the raiders began withdrawing towards the beach. During the retreat, CSM Stratton was hit 3 times in the stomach. His comrades administered morphine and dragged him along through deep snowdrifts towards the beach. Unfortunately, the paras soon found themselves in a desperate fight for their lives. While the 15 soldiers led by Lieutenant Hune were halted by Lieutenant Timothy's Rodneys as they approached Gossett Farm down at Villa Stella Maris, the 9 men under Sergeant Trains had secured a commanding position over the defile leading to the beach and were raining withering fire onto the paras below. The paras, lacking heavy weapons, could only rake the German trenches with machine gun fire and grenades to little effect. And every time they attempted to move from their positions, Sergeant Trains sent up a flare, forcing them to retreat. As Major Frost later lamented, "Unfortunately, we failed to spend quite as much time on the ranges as we should have done. There is no shortcut or substitute for skill at arms, and without this, enthusiasm and all the rest counted for little when there was a real enemy to contend with." As the firefight raged on, para after para was struck by German bullets and pulled away from the firing line. Meanwhile, the alarm was spreading throughout the local German command structure and hundreds of troops began descending on Bruneval from the surrounding towns. Yet as the Germans still did not know the raiders' true objectives, many of these troops were ordered to defend the approaches to the Freyr radar site. Nonetheless, if the paras did not break through immediately, they would soon find themselves surrounded. As Lieutenant Charteris later recalled, "The parties were all getting a bit mixed up, so we all advanced together to take the beach. I felt as naked as a baby, because I was only about 70 yards from the house, which I knew to be held by the enemy for more than a month. I had been studying the best ways of attacking the house. I'd looked at all the photographs, examined all the plans. But when the moment came to put all this into practice, reality seemed quite different from what I had imagined." In the midst of this chaos, a number of darkly comic episodes took place. While facing off with Sergeant Trains at Stella Maris, Corporal Vic Stewart was struck in the helmet by a bullet, crying out, "I've had it," before crumpling to the ground. His squad mate Corporal Rob Sterling immediately proceeded to relieve him of his wallet, fat with the winnings of a pre-mission card game. But suddenly, Stuart revived, the bullet having just grazed his head, and angrily demanded his wallet back. And while Lieutenant Tartarus' scattered Rodneys were making their way across the frozen countryside toward the beach, the last man in the formation tried to start a conversation with the man beside him, only to discover he was actually Wehrmacht Private Adolf Schmitz, who had become separated from his own platoon and accidentally joined the British patrol. There's no shot. Guten Tag. Hello, mates. Before the startled German could react, another para opened fire with his Sten gun, killing him. Meanwhile, in a last-ditch effort to break through to the beach, Sergeant Bill Sunley began attacking the barbed wire entanglements surrounding Stella Maris with wire cutters, while Major Frost launched a counterattack against the closing Germans to win his men some time. At the same time, Lieutenant Charteris's lost Rodneys finally arrived, shouting "Carber Feed," the war cry of the Seaforth Highlanders. Charteris and Sergeant David Grieve led the storming of the Stella Maris villa, silencing the guns and capturing another German prisoner, a Wehrmacht telephone operator named Corporal Schmidt. Moments later, at 0200 hours, Sergeant Sunley broke through the wire, and the raiders descended the defile down to the beach, with Major Vernon and the engineers abandoning their unwieldy handcart and simply carrying the radar components down the cliff. Once down, the engineers set to work sweeping for mines, while the other paras searched the nearby bathing huts, and within minutes, the beach was secure. Soon after, Corporal Douglas Campbell arrived from Sergeant Thomas Lum's stick, among the many who had been accidentally dropped far from the landing zone. On landing, Lum had ordered Bren gunner Private Alan Scott and signallers Private George Cornell and Private Frank Embury to stay put and hide, while he and Campbell set out to reconnoitre the area. Charteris ordered Campbell to go back and retrieve these men, along with their long-range number 18 wireless set that they would need to contact the extraction flotilla. The raiders had dropped into Bruneval with 2 such sets, as well as 5 number 38 sets for short-range communications between squads. However, these sets had been scattered around the target area and were notoriously unreliable to begin with. Indeed, poor radio communications were to be a fixture of British airborne operations for the duration of the war. Nonetheless, as these scattered sections slowly converged on the beach, spirits were high. As Frost later recalled, the object had been achieved. We had very few casualties. We knew roughly where everyone was and had given the enemy a good hammering. All we wanted now was the Navy. But as the minutes ticked by and the Germans drew ever nearer, there was still no sign of Lum's section nor of the other number 18 wireless set. The Paras tried using the shorter-range number 38 set to contact the flotilla, but received no response. They then turned on their Rebecca radio beacon, designed to be detected by the corresponding Eureka receiver aboard the LCAs, but had no way of knowing whether their signals were being received. In desperation, Lieutenant Ross fired green flares low across the beach, first from the north, then from the south, but again received no reply. For a brief moment, the Paras considered commandeering a nearby fishing boat, but this plan was quickly abandoned as the vessel could only carry up to 8 men. Slowly, a feeling of dread descended upon the beach, much as the Paras had felt during the disastrous combined exercises back in Britain. Every man began to realize that their extensive training, hard work, and extreme bravery might all have been for naught. Meanwhile, the extraction flotilla was waiting just 3 kilometers offshore. Unfortunately, the Army's insistence on manning the landing craft with its own men proved a poor decision, as all the gunners were bent double with seasickness. And while the flotilla's commander, Lieutenant Commander Cook, was actively watching the beach through binoculars, he found it hard to tell the Paras' signal flares from German signal flares and tracer fire. And after having heard nothing over the radio, he had no way of knowing if the Germans still held the beach, and was unwilling to risk sailing into an ambush. But then, at 02:30 hours, a half hour after the Paras had successfully taken the beach, he spotted a Morse code message being flashed by hand torch and ordered the flotilla to close in. Back on the beach, one Para spotted the approaching landing craft and excitedly exclaimed, "Sir, the boat's coming in. The boats are here. God bless the ruddy Navy, sir." While the original plan called for the landing craft to beach and be loaded in pairs, with the Germans closing in fast, this plan was thrown out of the window and the vessels arrived all at once. Eager to take part in the action, the gunners on board the craft immediately opened fire on the clifftop, but were immediately stopped by Major Frost, who reminded them that there were still stragglers somewhere in the countryside. After the vital radar components were bundled onto the vessels, the Paras quickly followed, so eager to get off the beach that one LCA departed, loaded with 68 men, rather than the usual 30. After a few minutes, the LCAs rendezvoused with the motor gunboats, aboard which Noah Donald Priest from R.V. Jones's scientific intelligence team was waiting to inspect the radar components. Confirming that the Paras had collected nearly everything asked of them, he immediately sent a signal to Jones. "Samples perfect. Their mission complete, the flotilla then set off across the channel toward Britain. It was an unpleasant journey, with all the paras, save for Frost, becoming violently seasick. But while at 0400 a squadron of German E-boats had set off from Le Havre in pursuit, the British flotilla soon came under the protection of the British destroyers HMS Fernie and HMS Blencarthra, and a group of French chasseur submarine chasers, while RAF Spitfires began flying a protective umbrella overhead. At last, at 10:00 hours on February the 28th, the flotilla sailed into Portsmouth safe and sound. But the mood of relief and accomplishment was tempered by a sobering fact that the raiders left 6 men behind in France. Private John Sutherland, wounded in the arm during the retreat, he was hidden by his comrades in a barn and later captured by the Germans. Private David Taffy Thomas, Lance Corporal James Jock McCallum, and Private John Willoughby of the Rodneys, who were ordered to stay put with their number 18 wireless set. They didn't reach the beach until after the extraction flotilla had departed, nor did Privates Cornell, Embury, and Scott, who had received similar orders. Tragically, in the men's scramble to reach the beach, Scott tumbled off the cliff and was mortally wounded. The others waved and screamed for the landing craft to come back, then turned on their long-range number 18 wireless set. However, Lieutenant Commander Cook informed the men that the ships could not turn back, leaving Embury and Cornell no choice but to flee into the countryside. Like the others, they were eventually captured and spent the rest of the war as POWs. In the end, the casualty list for Operation Biting totaled 2 killed, 6 wounded, and 6 captured for the British, against 5 killed, 2 wounded, and 2 captured for the Germans, remarkably low for such a risky operation. In exchange, the operation accomplished nearly all of its objectives. They captured Würzburg parts and sent them to R.V. Jones and his team, who quickly determined that the technology was in fact inferior to its British counterparts, the Germans having not yet developed the cavity magnetron that allowed for the efficient production of centimetric radar waves. The revelation allowed British scientists to develop a simple but highly effective countermeasure: strips of aluminium foil cut to half the radar's wavelength and dropped from aircraft, which returned extremely strong echoes that overwhelmed and blinded the German radar screens. Codenamed Window by the British, this countermeasure is still used today. It's known as chaff. However, the British were reluctant to deploy Window for fear that the Germans would immediately copy it and use it against British radar defenses. In fact, the Germans had independently developed an identical weapon codenamed Double, but had also hesitated to use it for the exact same reasons. In any case, Window would not be used in combat until the Operation Gomorrah firebombing raid against Hamburg in July 1943, in which this secret weapon, along with unusually dry hot weather and numerous other factors, allowed the British to set off a firestorm that killed an estimated 37,000 civilians.